They were born into palaces with marble floors, silk cradles, and names etched in dynasties. The world saw their families as untouchable, divine bloodlines destined to rule, but these children were never meant to be seen. They never wore royal robes, they didn't pose in portraits, and their names were carefully omitted from family records. Their existence was whispered about in private, or denied altogether, not because they committed treason, not because they brought shame, but simply because they were born different. In a world where power was built on the illusion of perfection, these children were hidden, erased, forgotten. For centuries, royalty depended not just on power, but on image. The illusion of perfection had to be absolute. Strong kings, beautiful queens, and heirs who looked like destiny itself. Monarchies portrayed their children as symbols of divine right, physical grace, and intellectual superiority. But what happened when a royal child didn't fit that image? What happened when a child was born who didn't walk or talk like other heirs? A child with eyes that mirrored joy, but whose presence disrupted the fantasy of flawless succession. Among the most hidden were royal children born with Down syndrome, a condition caused by the presence of an extra chromosome, known medically as trisomy 21. It affects development, learning, and physical features, but it doesn't affect the soul. Children with Down syndrome are loving, curious, deeply emotional. They learn differently, but they understand deeply. They feel happiness, sadness, connection, just like anyone else. But in the cold calculus of royal bloodlines, they were seen as a threat to a crown obsessed with legacy. A different child wasn't a person to embrace. They were a secret to bury. The most well-documented case is Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary of the United Kingdom. Born in 1905, John was cheerful and lively in his early years. He loved animals, nature, and play, the things any child would adore. But by age 4, John began experiencing epileptic seizures. His development slowed, his behavior became unpredictable. Though he was never formally diagnosed during his short life, modern historians believe John had Down syndrome or a similar neurological condition. As his condition worsened, John disappeared from public life. First he stopped attending family events. Then he was removed from official photographs. Eventually he was moved permanently to Wood Farm, a small house on the Royal Sandringham estate, far from London, far from court, far from view. At Wood Farm, John was cared for by a loving nanny, but lived in deep isolation. His parents rarely visited. His siblings saw him only occasionally. The boy who had been born into royalty was now growing up in quiet exile. In 1919, at just 13 years old, Prince John died after a violent seizure. Only then did newspapers acknowledge his existence. Even in death, the truth remained veiled. Reports called him fragile and delicate, but never explained why he had vanished from view. There was no state funeral, no royal procession, just a private burial and silence. Prince John's case is unique only because it was eventually uncovered. Across Europe, dozens of similar stories remain lost, buried under royal secrecy and historical shame. In Austria, members of the Habsburg dynasty, known for centuries of inbreeding and genetic complications, often produced children with severe physical or mental disabilities. These children were quietly sent to monasteries or distant estates. Their names never entered official records. Some were even declared stillborn, though midwives later admitted they had heard the babies cry. In Spain, a letter from the late 1800s describes a royal child born with the soul of an angel, but the mind of a lamb. That child never appeared in court records. Historians believe she was raised in secrecy by religious caretakers far from the capital. One haunting entry in a German duchess's journal reads, "She smiles when I sing and claps when I dance, but they say she must not be seen." Her daughter's name is unknown. Her fate, a lifetime in a private hospital, hidden away. In France, a memoir by a Bourbon princess recalls a sister whose mind wandered like the wind, sweet and ungraspable. Again, no birth certificate, no portrait, no trace. Even in Imperial Russia, where Tsarist children were celebrated in art and song, there are rumors. A nurse's diary from 1906 mentions a little girl born to the Romanovs who was as innocent as a dove and just as delicate. Her identity remains a mystery. She never appeared in public. Her grave was unmarked. All across Europe, the pattern repeats. A child born with Down syndrome, removed from royal life, erased from history. Not because they were unloved, but because their love wasn't enough to outweigh the fear of imperfection. The pain didn't stop with the children. Royal mothers bore the weight of these choices. In many cases, they were pressured or forced to give up their child. Not to strangers, but to silence. A mother might visit once a year. She might send letters, but rarely could she keep the child by her side. Doing so meant confronting the gaze of the public, the questions of the court, the whispers of scandal, and so, many stayed quiet, grieved alone, pretended the child never existed. Behind every hidden child was a palace that chose legacy over love, a crown that valued image more than innocence. These children did not fail royalty. Royalty failed them. Even now, most of their names are unknown. Their stories survive only in scattered diaries, redacted letters, or rumors whispered in the margins of royal history. They were born into power, but denied visibility, born into wealth, but denied warmth. And though they never sat on thrones, their absence shaped the very myth of royalty itself. Their only crime was being born different. By the dawn of the 20th century, a darker philosophy was gaining traction in the most powerful courts of Europe, one that would shape the fate of countless children before they ever had a chance to be seen. It was the rise of eugenics, the belief that human populations could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce and who wasn't. What began as academic theory soon crept into state policy. In monarchies, where bloodlines were sacred and carefully tracked, eugenics was seen as a safeguard against embarrassment, a way to explain away or prevent the birth of any child who didn't fit the myth of inherited greatness. Doctors and royal advisors, now influenced by pseudoscience, began quietly recommending that children with degeneracy of the mind or softness of constitution be removed from public sight. Royalty embraced these recommendations, not because they lacked affection for their children, but because they feared what those children represented. In private, kings and queens grieved. In public, they upheld the illusion. Among the more chilling examples was a royal council meeting in Central Europe in 1908, during which a physician delivered a report to the crown prince about a young relative exhibiting signs of arrested development. His advice was cold and clinical. The boy should be relocated permanently. His presence weakens the image of the house. The prince reportedly nodded and signed a relocation order. The child, whose name never entered the archives, was sent to a coastal villa under the care of a governess and a doctor. He lived there until his death at age 27. No portrait was ever painted. No grave was marked with the family crest. The eugenics movement didn't just offer royals a scientific excuse for exile, it offered moral cover. It gave monarchs a way to say, "This is not cruelty, this is preservation." The idea that a disabled child might damage the reputation of the crown became justification for permanent separation. Religious institutions, which often partnered with royalty, were complicit. In Italy, a 1912 agreement between a noble family and a convent tasked nuns with lifelong care of a child born underdeveloped and spiritually incomplete. In exchange, the convent received monthly gold payments and strict instructions to limit outside contact. One letter from the abbess read, "The child sings beautifully and responds to kindness. We do not speak of her name here. She is known only to God." The burden, as always, fell heaviest on the mothers. To give birth to a child who did not meet royal standards was seen by many queens and duchesses as a personal failure, as if their wombs had betrayed the realm. Some internalized this belief. Others resisted quietly, only to be overruled by husbands, doctors, and court ministers. A few tried to keep their children close, but were gradually forced into compliance through pressure, isolation, or scandal. In 1896, a Scandinavian princess gave birth to a daughter who could not speak and failed to meet developmental milestones. She insisted the child remain in the palace nursery. For 4 years she resisted pressure to send her away, but after a foreign ambassador witnessed the child during a royal reception, rumors began to circulate. A month later the girl was gone, officially taken on a long holiday to a seaside estate. She never returned. A decade later, the princess's personal letters revealed the truth. They told me she would shame the court, that love was not enough, that silence was the only path forward. In some cases, royal families didn't just hide the children, they rewrote the narrative entirely. Official statements declared stillbirths or infant deaths, even when the child was alive and well. In rare moments when the truth emerged decades later, the world looked back not with anger, but with sorrow, at a monarchy so frightened of vulnerability that it erased its own blood. Historians investigating royal archives in the Netherlands found a family Bible with 5 names listed, but only 3 ever appeared in public records. The missing 2, believed to be twin girls born with intellectual disabilities, were sent to a countryside orphanage under assumed names. They lived into adulthood. Neither knew they were princesses. Even when hidden away, these children weren't always neglected. Many were deeply loved by their caregivers, nurses, nannies, priests, or governesses, who offered them the affection denied by the throne. A caregiver's journal found in a German manor read, He is my joy. When he laughs, the house feels warm. I fear the day they take him from me. These quiet bonds forged far from court were the only lifelines these children had, but they could not undo the pain of exile. For while they may have lived comfortably, they lived without recognition, without legitimacy, without a name that was truly theirs. The fear of exposure was so great that even servants were sworn to silence. In many cases, staff members who interacted with disabled royal children were required to sign oaths or contracts forbidding disclosure, violations of which could mean imprisonment or banishment. This created an atmosphere of shame and secrecy that lasted for generations. In a northern French duchy, an elderly cook who had worked in the household for over 40 years admitted on her deathbed, "There was a boy in the East Wing. He never spoke, but he painted with his hands. They said he was not royal, but he looked just like the Duke." Sometimes, even those closest to the throne carried that silence to the grave. All of this happened not in the Dark Ages, but within the last 150 years. Within the age of photography, of modern medicine, of written constitutions. And yet these children remained invisible, not because they had no light, but because the world refused to look. As the 20th century marched forward and war reshaped Europe, many monarchies fell. Some were abolished entirely, others reformed, shrinking their power and opening their archives. Only then did pieces of the truth begin to emerge. Pictures, letters, birth records that had been hidden in private chapels or dusty trunks. Suddenly, the perfect portraits of royal families began to show cracks, missing faces, unspoken names, hidden wings of palaces that once echoed with forgotten laughter. These revelations didn't destroy the legacy of royalty, but they changed how we understand it. A crown may symbolize glory, but it has also symbolized silence, and the children it silenced were never lost, only waiting to be remembered. By the mid-20th century, the modern world was changing, but the shadows that cloaked royal children with disabilities remained. Even as science advanced and public attitudes began to shift, the royal families of Europe remained behind the veil. The pain they had hidden for generations had become not just policy, but tradition. In many monarchies, the birth of a different child had evolved into a quiet ritual of disappearance. There was no longer a need for dramatic cover-ups. The systems were already in place. The doctors knew what to say, the nurses knew what not to record. The public, trained by centuries of curated images, never even thought to ask. Photographs remained tightly controlled, family trees omitted certain branches. In some cases, even siblings were never told about the brother or sister they lost, not to death but to secrecy. In Belgium during the 1940s, a royal aide later confessed that a child born with severe developmental delays had been moved to a private estate by the sea before their first birthday. His name was never spoken, the aide said, not out of cruelty, but because everyone believed it was better that way. This was the lie that echoed through palaces across Europe. It's better this way, better for the child, better for the crown, better for the future. But in truth, it was better only for the myth. As democratic values spread across post-war Europe, many monarchies became symbolic rather than ruling, but their obsession with image remained. Even stripped of absolute power, these families clung to their perfection and to the belief that disability had no place within it. Some exceptions began to emerge. In Sweden, the royal family eventually acknowledged a cousin with a mild developmental disability and provided her with lifelong support. In the Netherlands, quiet reforms ensured that children with special needs in noble households were given education, not exile. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. The majority remained silent. What makes these stories so haunting is not just the secrecy, but the deep, quiet humanity that persisted in the margins. The nurse who brought fresh flowers to a child's bedside every morning, the nun who taught a forgotten princess how to read, the gardener who left toys beneath the window of a child he was never allowed to meet. In a private letter dated 1953, a French noblewoman described visiting a remote convent where her cousin, a girl with Down syndrome, had lived since infancy. The girl did not recognize her. She had no idea who her family was. She smiled at me, the letter read, and touched my scarf. I told her I loved her. Then I left, and no one ever spoke of her again. There is something unspeakably heavy in that kind of love. Love stripped of recognition, confined by duty, swallowed by shame. And yet, these children loved too. Their lives, though quiet, were not without joy. Many were described as deeply affectionate. They sang, they danced, they delighted in sunlight and soft fabrics, and the laughter of birds outside their windows. In the rare records that survive, letters from caretakers, scribbled notes in medical files, we glimpse their world, not royal, not public, but real. One caregiver from Bavaria wrote, "He laughs when I clap. He kisses my hands. He hugs the pillows and talks to them like friends. He does not speak clearly, but he understands music." In another letter from Denmark, a nun describes a child's daily routine. "We brush her hair with pink ribbons. She eats slowly, but politely. When she prays, she closes her eyes so tight that her whole face shakes." These moments, soft, unguarded, invisible to history, were the only legacy most of them left behind. But not all were allowed such peace. As the 1960s brought waves of institutional reform across Europe, many of the old private hospitals and convent-run wards began to shut down. Royal children, now adults, were quietly transferred to modern psychiatric facilities. Some died within months, unable to adapt. Others, now elderly, lived out their final years in anonymity, surrounded by strangers. Few were ever reunited with their families. In one heartbreaking account from Italy, a woman in her 60s believed to be the daughter of a noble family was found in a state hospital with only a silver ring bearing her crest. She never spoke her full name, but when a historian showed her a photograph of a distant relative, she wept and whispered, "I know him." Even as late as the 1980s, there were whispers of children born into royalty and quietly erased. These were not medieval sins, these were modern decisions, and then slowly the curtain began to lift. It started with questions. A missing name on a genealogy chart, a nurse's testimony, a declassified medical file. Journalists, historians, and human rights advocates began to investigate. In 1998, the British public learned more about Prince John than had ever been disclosed in the century since his death. His story, once buried, was told in books, documentaries, and exhibitions. People saw his face, they heard his voice in old letters, and for the first time, many realized that royalty had a very human cost. Other nations followed. Denmark opened records. France allowed limited access to church archives. In Austria, a historian uncovered dozens of baptismal entries marked with the Latin phrase non declaratura, not declared. These were believed to be disabled royal children, erased with ink and intention. But even now, most of their stories remain lost. No names, no gravestones, no portraits, just a lingering silence, echoing louder than any royal anthem ever played. What do we inherit when we crown a legacy built on silence? What kind of history survives when it has been edited for perfection? These questions matter, because the story of royal children with Down syndrome is not just a footnote, it's a mirror that asks us to confront how much we value image over truth, power over compassion, appearances over people. And while we cannot go back and hold those children, we can remember them, we can speak of them, we can say without shame that they were here, they existed, they mattered, and their only crime was being born into a world that refused to see them. In recent years, there has been a quiet reckoning, not loud or scandalous, but slow and careful, as more royal institutions cautiously acknowledge the hidden chapters in their histories. Biographers now mention the children who were once ignored, historians search archives once sealed, and descendants ask the questions their ancestors were too afraid to raise. In the United Kingdom, the story of Prince John has been reintroduced into school curriculums and documentaries. Once forgotten, his photographs now hang in museums. Viewers see his gentle smile, his wide eyes, and his delicate frame, not as a symbol of weakness, but of truth. In Denmark, noble families have begun including all children in their family trees, regardless of diagnosis or public role. One noble woman, whose great-aunt had been institutionalized for most of her life, paid for her name to be engraved on the family mausoleum. "She was one of us," she said. "She always was." These small acts of remembrance don't erase the past, but they challenge the myth of perfection and offer a new legacy based not on silence but on sincerity. Some royal households remain quiet, some still keep their records sealed, but others, in Norway, Belgium, Sweden, have begun offering support for special needs programs in honor of children they once hid. These gestures, though modest, represent a shift in how power can confront its own past. And yet, no apology has ever been issued. No royal house has fully owned the pain it inflicted through erasure. No formal statement has acknowledged that children with Down syndrome were sent away, not because they were unlovable, but because they didn't fit the image of divine succession. Perhaps they never will, because to acknowledge them is to admit that the story of monarchy, of grandeur, legacy, purity, has always been, at least in part, a lie. The children were never the problem. The problem was a world built on the fantasy of flawlessness. But the world is changing. Today, children with Down syndrome are artists, students, workers, siblings. They appear in films, graduate from universities, and live lives rich with connection, creativity, and joy. Parents no longer hide their children. They fight for them. They celebrate them. And as societies become more inclusive, the old royal silence stands out even more, because the truth is, many of those hidden royal children might have thrived in today's world. With therapy, support, and acceptance, they could have spoken, learned, painted, played music, shared meals with their siblings, laughed in the gardens, sat at family dinners. They didn't need titles, they didn't need palaces, they just needed to be loved openly. But instead, they were left behind by families obsessed with image. Their stories were stolen, their names lost to time, and yet, despite it all, they existed. They lived, they smiled, they reached for their mothers, they giggled at candlelight, they kissed the cheeks of nannies, they drew suns and flowers on scraps of paper. They hummed lullabies no one else remembered. In their quiet way, they proved that the soul doesn't need a crown to shine. And now, their memory lives not in golden halls or royal decrees, but in stories like this, stories that resurrect what history tried to erase. If you've made it this far, then you've carried part of that legacy too. Not just learning history, but resurrecting it, reclaiming what was hidden, honoring what was silenced. Because for every queen who wept in secret, for every nurse who tucked in a forgotten child, for every sibling who never knew the brother they had, there was always another who refused to forget. And that is the power of stories, of whispers turned into voices, of remembering those who were told they did not belong. They did belong, they still do. And if no crown was ever placed on their head, then let this be their coronation, not of gold, but of memory, not of monarchy, but of meaning. Their only crime was being born different, and for that they were cast aside. But here, in this story, they are seen. If stories like this speak to you, if they move something deep inside you that textbooks never could, then this channel is your home. Subscribe now, not because you're told, but because you belong in a place that honors the truths they tried to erase. Here, we don't just remember history, we give it a voice.